Today's weekend recap of how things have been going in the raid will be slightly more interesting than the one we had for Mythic Plus yesterday, simply because a few more things actually changed in the raid compared to Mythic Plus. Well, after all, in Mythic Plus the meta is much more strict. You tend to see at the high level practically the same 3 to 4 specs when it comes to DPS, for example, whereas for the raid you have way more options to actually see more or less all of the specs, at least have a chance to perform in the raid. Now, the most important thing that happened, of course, in the past, well, not couple, but 1.5 resets, was the balance tuning that landed at this point some 12 days ago, which in terms of focus went on, for example, buffing the Frostfire hero talent of Frost and Fire Mage. It went on to also buff Feral Druid, to buff Windwalker Monk, to buff Deathstalker Subtlety Rogue. It also buffed Farseer Elemental Shaman. It buffed Holy Priest, and then more notably also nerfed Enhancement and Protection Paladin. Now, the first clear thing compared to previous times before these changes has been, of course, the increased performance of both Subtlety Rogue and Fire Mage. Now you have Subtlety at number 1 and you have Fire Mage at number 5. Now, if you look at the standings, instead of looking at the past week, the past reset based after these results, and instead you check out the entire tier worth of performance from all of these specs, well, this is quite self-explanatory. This is your sub rogue, and this is the day, practically 25th to 26th of November is when the patch came through, and that's the improvement of Subtlety Rogue, which was already doing quite well to begin with, and now it has been doing even better. Now, admittedly though, when it comes to Subtlety, it's not that they were a particularly popular spec. To be fair, we could be saying the same thing about Fire Mage, which is also not a particularly popular spec. However, they were also buffed. They were the ones receiving the largest of the buffs in this tuning when it came to Frostfire. You can see here, Subtlety, after the patch, correctly moved over most of the bosses to play over with Deathstalker, which is the newly buffed hero talent of Subtlety. Then, if you check the same thing for Mage, for Fire Mage, you will see that pretty much besides boss number 1, boss Ulgrax with some Fury, the rest of the bosses now have a larger majority Frostfire picks. It's pretty much just the add AoE phase bosses like Brute Twister as well, where some Fury is still the choice. But for the rest, Fire Mage has fully switched over to Frostfire. And we see, based on the results, where Fire Mage, for pretty much the season, has been hanging down towards the worst level, we can say, because the only one below them was Augmentation, right? So Fire Mage was effectively the worst performer for basically the first part, the first couple of months of the season. Then 25th, 26th of November is when the patch goes live, and this is the result now of Fire Mage. So, Fire Mage has had by far, if you can make sense of all of these squiggly lines, the one with the largest jump, pretty much. They jumped from 2nd worst to 4th best. So they jumped up like 18 ranks amongst the other DPS specs, which has definitely been the biggest jump in performance from last week, even a couple of weeks ago, to now. Fire Mage has gotten the best improvement. Subtleties was only like a couple of positions, but Fire definitely had the largest. Now, what we are a little bit more confused by is that according to our calculations, who should have also been around here and possibly also here would have been Windwalker and Feral, because Windwalker and Feral have also been buffed in this last set of changes. Now, you do see Feral, after the 25th of November, do get the increase in performance, right over there, and Windwalker also kind of does get a bit of an increase in performance, but definitely not nearly as large as we would have expected based on their numbers, especially Windwalker, which should have been some 5+% increase in performance from here. A 5% damage buff from 77.8 score should have brought them up to about 81 to 82 in terms of core, which is about here. Instead, they are still down here at 78.4. So they actually barely increased compared to the size of their buff last reset, a couple of resets ago. Now, the other change, which unfortunately we have also been seeing in Mythic Plus, not really changing too much in the raid, was the nerf given to Enhancement Shaman. right? Because again, if we just shrink the results a little bit more, yes, you can see it from the 25th to the 26th of November when the patch goes live, enhancement goes further down, right? They get shrunk by a bit, which was the 4% nerf they received. Although a 4% nerf should have brought them down to about 82 points on average in terms of results, which should have been around here. Instead, they are still combating for first place to the newly buffed sub-rogue, with one minor, tiny difference, that the sub-rogue in popularity is here and the enhancement in popularity is here, which is about 15 times, slightly less than 15 times less popular than enhancement is in the raid. There isn't just a blue line getting worse in the reset, there is also a blue line getting better, because right as enhancement was being nerfed, you also had elemental growing over time since the buff to now actually continue to rise, actually very close to enhancement now. So Elemental was the one that got its Farseer hero talent buffed back when they were practically exclusively playing Stormbringer. So after the changes, after the buffs given to Farseer, now you have Stormbringer, very similar to Mage, still playing some Fury on a fight like Olgrax, but then outside of Olgrax, you have Farseer being played on Bloodbound Horror, and from then onwards they are played on Sikran, Rashanan. You have a bunch of ads, you go back to playing Stormbringer, same goes for Broad Twister, you are back for a single target fight, you are back playing with Nexus Princess. So that has been pretty much the divide of Elemental between the target count choices of bosses, whether it is more single target heavy playing Farseer or have any chance of blasting some ads so that you get to play Stormbringer. You know, this is the Shaman, and this is the damage done to the Blood Parasites as Stormbringer, which is 628 million damage done to the ads. So if you just look at the damage done to the ads, Elemental Shaman is getting a lot of work in compared to many of the other specs. Of course, there is a tiny minor difference. Yes, they are matching a Marksmanship Hunter in terms of AoE damage, and they are even matching a Fury Warrior in terms of AoE damage to the small ads. However, once you go back to all damage done, there is a significant gap from the rest of their damage compared to the damage of the Elemental Shaman, even as a Stormbringer Elemental Shaman. Even if you switch from Brute Twister back to Rashanan, that is what overall allows them to be having such good results. In here, Rashanan, you look at the Elemental Shaman, they have 113 million damage done to the Infested Spawn, which is, surprise, tons of damage. However, even after you remove the damage to the ads and only count the boss damage, Elemental is still doing very well. So not only are they dominating the burst damage done on ads, their single target damage is still okay. Of course, they switch over to Farseer when they have to go for pure or almost pure single target, like a fight like Nexus Princess, and being able to choose, being able to have this choice of which hero talent you want to go for better performance has allowed them to significantly increase their performance over the last 10 or so days, to the point that now they are again one of the better performing specs together with their class sibling enhancement. So disappointing result post buffs to Windwalker and to Feral, but very positive changes post buffs to both Elemental as well as Fire Mage. Now the other spec that was also buffed was Frost Mage. However, the buff to Frost Mage doesn't seem to have the same effect of the buff to Fire. You can see here that after being buffed, even if we shrink the timeline, the line of Frost Mage is the same. Like, they were here and they continue to be practically at the same level. Why? Well, because Frost Mage, while being buffed as Frostfire, Frost Mage didn't actually care. So practically they did not get buffed, because what was buffed for them is something that they are still not playing with when it comes to your hero talents in the raid, except very recently more Frostfire mages playing on Queen Ansurek. So it is half of the top results of a single boss in the entire tier where they have been moving over to Frostfire. That's why overall they don't really get any major improvement in their performance. The very last of the buffed spec, as we also mentioned last time, was Holy. Holy Priest was buffed in very simply, the flat healing of its Holy Words, Serenity and Sanctify, which was a good 3 to 5% healing done buff overall. But for healers, we have been less critical over the course of the tier. We have seen more shrinkage of a gap between the power of the specs. This was Holy Priest, and this was Holy Priest after getting buffed, increasing in its performance. We can say that now the gap from when Flame Shaper Evoker was doing super well and the priests were doing much worse. Now the gap is, you know, it's closer to where it was before. And even looking at the actual number, as we often point out, the gap between top and bottom is much tighter, with the current outlier at the moment being Discipline, because the gap from the now buffed Holy Priest to Preservation Evoker is 130,000 HPS. 130,000 is about 8% of 1.6 million, 7% of 1.6 million. So the gap between here and here is only 7 to 8%, which isn't much. So we have less to complain about or to worry about the balance of the specs when you look at the healers compared to the DPS, because the amount of healing it is much less drastic, being lower or higher in healing compared to the DPS. You know, even the DPS, for example, if you exclude, of course, augmentation, the gap from unholy to enhancement, so practically 10%. Right, 1.5 million, 150,000. It's a 10% gap from top to bottom in terms of damage, which is of course larger. It's more meaningful compared to the power of healing, because for healers you might have things like major impacting cooldowns. You know, maybe the healer that is 10% behind also has much stronger raid cooldowns. So overall, it becomes more valuable than the one that's here. But for DPS, it is not very often the case. We definitely used to have times, and we definitely used to have boss fights where certain specs are definitely down here, but they have very powerful, you know, 2-minute burst cooldowns, and there is a very dangerous add or a very dangerous phase of a boss you want to burn through. So a spec doing less damage overall, but being able to burst harder overall was preferred, was favored over others. Good example, we have Balanced Druid here. If you remember, Balanced Druid back in Shadowlands, Ventir, Ravenous Frenzy, Balanced Druid had one of the lowest average damage in the raid, but they were a staple of top world first and even top like 50 guilds because of their burst damage was so useful despite having low overall damage. So in terms of changes from the balance tuning of the raid, as mentioned, we have the slightly disappointing changes post buffs of Feral and Windwalker, and the positive ones of Elemental and Fire Mage, with Holy Priest getting a reasonable increase compared to before, but the healing gap being less of a problem or less visible than the power changes, the power and differences we have amongst the DPS specs in the raid right now. So for today and for the foreseeable future, this is the situation when it comes to raid power. Of course, in about 10 days or so, we are getting 11.0.7. We are getting the new special ring with some new special effect, which might or might not make some of these specs particularly OP. This is bound to happen, you know. Some of those gems will have a proc per minute, which will somehow be affected by haste, so perhaps certain haste stacking specs will get to benefit a lot from those gems and gain way more damage than certain other specs, etc, etc. That is possibly something that will happen once the patch goes live, but for today, on this Saturday, this is what we have for the recap of the situation in the meta of this first raid in the War Within. So for today, on this Saturday, it is now time to leave each other once again. Thanks, of course, as usual, for having watched the video, together with, of course, supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, meat. I am on a meat spree these past few days. I need my proteins. I'm walking too much.